Night fell quick and heavy over Willow Bend, swallowing the plains in a velvet darkness that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself wished to hide what was unfolding at the lone ranch. And as the sheriff and his men dismounted at the gate, Judge Mercer pushed forward, with a fury that came not just from fear for his missing wife, but from years of pride and unspoken rivalries, his eyes burning into Ethan, Crow as though he could force guilt out of him by sheer will. Yet before the judge could utter another accusation, Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the barn, leaning weakly against the frame, her voice trembling as she told them she was safe, that Ethan had helped her. But her words hardly eased the tension brewing between the two men. For while the sheriff looked uncertain and the deputies exchanged uneasy glances, the judge's expression twisted with something far more complex than relief. It was a flicker of fear, quickly masked, and Ethan caught it, realizing with a sinking weight that whatever Eleanor had overheard in the courthouse, those urgent whispers about moving funds, disposing of evidence, and shutting down anyone who gets too close, they might point not to a nameless threat in the shadows, but to someone far closer to her than anyone wanted to admit. And as the sheriff insisted she be taken to town for medical care, Eleanor froze, her fingers clawing into the doorway as she insisted she could not return, that she had seen something she was never meant to see, something dangerous enough to make people track her across the plains. Confusion erupted, the judge insisting she was delirious, the sheriff trying to coax her gently, while Ethan watched her with the steady patience of someone who had learned the hard way to believe the whispers of frightened people. And when Eleanor suddenly turned to Ethan and begged him, not her husband, not the law, to take her somewhere safe, the rancher felt the blood drain from the night air around him, for her trust in him only deepened the wedge of suspicion digging into the judge's heart. And before anyone could question her further, a shot cracked through the darkness, echoing across the open land like thunder waking the dead, sending horses rearing and deputies diving for cover. And as dust exploded at the judge's feet, everyone realized the bullet had not come from anyone present. Shadows moved along the ridge, figures barely visible under the moonlit sweep of clouds, and Ethan grabbed Eleanor, pulling her behind the barn as a second shot rang out, this one shattering a lantern and throwing sparks into the dry straw. Chaos erupted as the sheriff's men returned fire, the judge shouting orders, but the attackers remained hidden, trained, too coordinated to be random outlaws, and Ethan, with Eleanor trembling against his chest, realized whoever wanted her silenced had followed her here and would not stop until the truth she carried was buried. With no time to argue, he hoisted her onto his horse and swung into the saddle, shouting to the sheriff that he was taking her to the bluffs where they could lose the gunman. And though the judge roared that Ethan was kidnapping her, Eleanor silenced him with a desperate plea, insisting that if they stayed, more people would die. The horse bolted into the night, hooves hammering the ground as Ethan steered toward the canyon trails, the wind tearing at Eleanor's hair as she held on, whispering fragments of what she had overheard, names she recognized, names of men with power, names of men people trusted, men plotting something that would ruin lives and turn the town into a pawn in a deadly game of land rights and corruption. Ethan listened, his jaw tightening as he pieced together the truth. The judge had unknowingly stumbled into a conspiracy, one so perilous that even his wife's accidental discovery had made her a target. And as the gunfire faded behind them and the plains opened into yawning darkness, Ethan vowed silently that he would protect her, not because she was the judge's wife, not because he feared the men hunting them, but because he had once failed to save the people he loved, and he would not fail again. They reached the bluffs just as the moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light over the jagged rocks, and Ethan led Eleanor into a narrow crevice where they could rest for a moment, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling from adrenaline. And as she leaned against him, whispering that she feared the judge did not know the danger he was in, Ethan assured her they would return at dawn, armed with truth and strategy. But for now they had to survive the night. Somewhere far below, faint echoes of hoofbeats drifted through the canyon, signs that the gunmen were still searching. And as Ethan watched the horizon, he felt the weight of a storm building, not a weather storm, but a storm of betrayal, justice, and reckoning that would soon crash over Willow Bend with a fury no one could escape. And as Eleanor finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, he gazed toward the direction of town, knowing the next day would force truths into the open that powerful men had fought desperately to keep buried. For now, their only safety lay in silence and shadows. But when morning came, the lone rancher would ride into Willow Bend not as a suspect, not as a recluse, but as the only man willing to expose the horrifying secret threatening to consume the town, a secret far more dangerous than what anyone believed he had done to the judge's wife. And with that thought, Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle and prepared for a dawn that would change everything. And to everyone following this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the explosive chapters ahead. Because the truth in Willow Bend is just beginning to surface, and what comes next will be even more thrilling than you can imagine. The first pale streaks of dawn slid across the canyon walls like cautious fingers feeling their way into the night's forgotten corners. And Ethan Crow, who had not slept even a heartbeat, watched the sky brighten with the steady patience of a man who had learned long ago that truth always rises with the sun, no matter how hard powerful men try to bury it. And as Eleanor stirred beside him, her breath still unsteady from the night's terror, he told her it was time to finish what had been forced upon them. Because a town built on lies can stand for years, but the moment those lies start hunting innocent people, the ground beneath it begins to crack. They rode out before the sun fully crowned the hills, their horses' hooves echoing softly across the empty plains as dust rose like smoke behind them. And somewhere far in the distance, coyotes yipped at the dying remnants of night, unaware that men, not beasts, were the true predators stalking Willow Bend. As they neared the town, Eleanor's grip tightened around Ethan's waist, her voice trembling as she asked whether the judge would believe her, whether he would stand with truth or with the men who whispered in his ear and fed on his authority. And Ethan, though unsure, assured her that truth has a way of stripping a man bare, either revealing his courage or his corruption. When they reached the outer fence of Willow Bend, the sheriff waited with a handful of deputies, his face lined with worry, for after the gunfire at the ranch, rumors had torn through town like wildfire, some claiming the rancher had abducted Eleanor, others insisting the judge had ordered men to silence her, and still others whispering that the real danger lay with outsiders who wanted to seize the valley's water rights and needed the town's silence to do so. Ethan stepped down first, helping Eleanor dismount, and the sheriff, relieved to see her alive, urged them both to hurry, for the judge had called an emergency gathering in the courthouse, a gathering that felt less like a meeting and more like a trial waiting for a man to stand. Defenseless, they arrived to find the entire town packed into the courthouse yard, faces tense, voices low, as Judge Mercer stood on the steps with a proclamation in hand, declaring Ethan Crow a suspect in his wife's mysterious disappearance and warning that the rancher had a history of emotional instability. But before he could continue, weaving the noose of accusation, Eleanor stepped forward, the crowd parting in startled silence as she pushed past the deputies, her voice steady but trembling with hurt as she declared that she had not been harmed by Ethan, that he had saved her life, and that the true danger lay with the very men standing behind the judge, men she had overheard plotting to seize the town's water, sources and profit from selling the land to a mining company that cared nothing for the people who lived there. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like a rising storm, and the judge, visibly shaken, demanded to know what she was talking about, insisting she was confused. But before he could dismiss her claim, two of the men at his side stiffened, their faces hardening with the cold calculation of cornered wolves. And Ethan recognized them, not from the town, but from the night before. shadows that had fired into the darkness with the precision of hired guns. The sheriff, catching the shift in their posture, placed a hand on his revolver, and for a breathless moment it seemed the courthouse steps might become the stage of a deadly standoff. But instead of reaching for his weapon, one of the hired men made a fatal mistake. He spoke, cursing Eleanor publicly for knowing too much and revealing, without meaning to, that they were indeed working under orders, not from the judge, but from a coalition of businessmen who had manipulated him for months, feeding him false information, forging documents, and using his authority to push through land transfers he never realized were fraudulent. The crowd erupted, shouts rising like thunder, and the judge, stunned and pale, stared at Eleanor with eyes full of guilt and dawning horror, realizing not only that he had been misled, but that the men using him had nearly gotten his own wife killed, and his voice cracked as he apologized to her, to Ethan, to the entire town. But apologies alone could not mend the damage, nor stop the men who, sensing exposure, attempted to flee, only to be stopped by the sheriff's deputies. With their arrest, the truth poured out like water finally freed from a dam. Fake deeds, stolen records, hired gunmen, plans to run the rancher off his land because his property sat over the most valuable water spring in the valley, and the townspeople, when suspicious of Ethan, now saw clearly the burden he had carried and the danger he had unknowingly stood against. When the last of the conspirators were taken away, Judge Mercer stepped toward Ethan, humbled, thanking him for saving Eleanor and admitting he owed the rancher more than he could ever repay. And though Ethan accepted his words, he made it clear that he had not acted to earn favor or forgiveness, but because no one deserves to be hunted for telling the truth. In the following days, Willow Bend slowly mended, trust rebuilt, laws reinforced, and the judge working tirelessly to correct the damage done under his watch, while Eleanor regained her strength and found her voice again. As for Ethan Crow, he returned to his ranch, not as the shadowed, misunderstood outsider he had once been, but as a man the town finally respected, a man who had protected one of their own when the world turned dark. And though he preferred solitude, he no longer rode the plains with the same heavy loneliness, for he knew now that silence is not the same as isolation, and even the quietest man can shape the fate of an entire town when the truth needs defending. And so the story of the lone rancher came to rest, not in tragedy but in justice, not in violence but in revelation. And if you've followed this tale to its end, make sure to subscribe, because more stories full of mystery, grit, suspense, and heart are on the way, and you won't want to miss a single one of them.